I was late getting home from a colleague's birthday party. The night had dragged on longer than I'd planned, and the streets were eerily quiet, a silence that seemed heavy and unsettling, as if the world was holding its breath. The dim light of the street lamps only emphasized the emptiness, making me acutely aware of my own loneliness. As I approached the entrance of my house, I noticed someone sitting on a bench near the entrance, a spot usually occupied by elderly ladies gossiping during the day. In the dim light, I could barely make out a figure, but it was clearly a woman. Consumed with curiosity, I moved closer and recognized her. It was Emily, the neighbor from the second floor. She and her husband, Daniel, had only recently moved here. Emily looked disheveled, her head drooping and her eyes glassy. She'd obviously had too much to drink. "Emily, what are you doing here?" I asked softly. She mumbled something incoherent at first, then fell silent. "Concerned?" I crouched down next to her. Her face was pale, her expression absent, but her hands trembled slightly, a silent sign of the excitement brewing on the surface. She seemed to be overwhelmed by a storm of emotions, each struggling for control. Her sunken eyes testified to sleepless nights and a mind overflowing with worry that had her on the verge of a breakdown. "I'm fine, James," she finally whispered, but her demeanor gave away her words. As I was about to leave, she suddenly called out to me in a fragile voice, "Wait, don't go." I hesitated, then turned around. Emily was struggling to stand on her feet, her legs wobbly. I instinctively reached out a hand to support her. "Let me walk you home," I offered. She nodded weakly, leaning heavily on me as we walked toward her apartment. Her steps were uncoordinated, and I wondered why Daniel wasn't with her. "Where's Daniel?" I asked cautiously. Her voice shook as she replied, He's with someone else tonight." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, rendering me speechless for a moment. A wave of discomfort and pity swept over me, and I struggled to find the right words, feeling the weight of her pain settle between us. The pain in her words was unmistakable, and I decided not to continue. When we got to her door, Emily got tangled up in her bag and dropped her keys. I bent down to pick them up in the door for her. Inside, she collapsed into a chair in the hallway, burying her face in her hands. "Emily, you need to rest," I said softly. She nodded without looking up. I helped her to the couch where she lay down, breathing raggedly. When I turned to leave, she grabbed my arm. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of despair and fear, and for a moment I felt completely powerless. Then she began to cry, quietly at first, but soon her sobs grew louder, shaking her small figure. "Everything is falling apart, James," she gasped through her tears. "Daniel left me for another woman. I don't know what to do." Her words hung in the air like an admission that her life was falling apart. I did the only thing I could think of. I hugged her comfortingly. But even in that moment, a tangle of emotions raged inside me, hesitation, guilt, and a desperate desire to ease her pain. I wondered if I was really helping her, or just giving in to a momentary need to act, not knowing if my actions would bring comfort or aggravate the wounds she carried within her. She pressed herself against me, trembling, her vulnerability palpable. And then, as if seeking comfort in the only way she knew how, she kissed me. The kiss caught me off guard. I recoiled for a moment, but her eyes, full of desperation and longing, sought mine. Before I knew it, we were in a whirlwind of emotions, one after the other. We ended up on the couch, crossing a line I had no intention of crossing. When morning came, I woke up next to her, disoriented at first. Memories of the night before came flooding back to me, and guilt gnawed at me. I dressed quietly, trying not to wake her, and slipped out of the apartment. I didn't see Emily for the next few days. She seemed to be avoiding me, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. The weight of what had happened cast an oppressive shadow over me that I couldn't shake off. Every time I walked past her door, a feeling of regret and anxiety clenched in my chest. I thought back to that night again and again, doubting my decisions and wondering if I'd made things worse. Guilt gnawed at me, but also a strange sense of responsibility made me torn between reaching out and keeping my distance. I knew she was at her breaking point, seeking comfort in her darkest moment. But our actions hadn't solved anything. They only added another layer of complexity to an already painful situation.